Dr. Chu, could you just go ahead and sort of introduce yourself a little bit for people who may be unfamiliar in our Sangha? And this will be going on YouTube as well.
Well, there's not much interesting about me to belabor upon. Um, I have been a student of meditation for much of my life, and right now I'm teaching Buddhism at University of the West. I've done my PhD in Buddhist studies at UCLA.
Yeah, yeah. I think really grateful for having you here, William. I have questions about the Chinese Sutta, the Agama. I have heard, I'm not sure. I've heard that some of the compared to the trans at the Pali Canon, the translated English version one, there's a lot of missing nuances that Agama seems to capture it better. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, the Chinese agamas are different than what you will find in the Pali Canon in at least the following important way. It's a multi-sectarian collection, meaning that unlike the Pali Canon, which is straightforwardly a Tamrasatika slash Theravada sectarian version of affairs, the Chinese contained materials from the Mahasamgika, from the Mula, Shavastavada, from Shavastavada, you name it. So there are at least materials from 5 or 6 different sets, and what that you provide us is a variety of point of views on certain doctrinal points. And you could clearly see, say, for example, where the sectarian lines are divided. You could also see where are the commonalities and presumably what were present prior to the sectarian split. To give you examples, the Chinese Agama sometimes contain either proto-Abhidhamic, late Abhidhamic materials as well as proto-Mahayana materials. Offer points of views are quite different than what you will find in the Pali Canon.
Uh, oh, sorry. By the way, I think uh, uh, I'm
You're
By the way,
cutting
we
out
can
for us,
make this,
Ivan.
we can make this conversation very casual. So, whenever you feel like joining, chiming in, raising issues, feel free to do so fluidly. We don't necessarily have to take turn while we wait for, I guess, that was Ivan, right, to come back or to wait until his reception is stabilized. Please feel free just to take over, to unmute yourself, and to speak up whenever you like.
I think that what Ivan was mentioning is that there is a sutta that is equivalent to the Majjhima Nikaya 118, the Anapanasati Sutta,
Right,
where
right.
the breathing short is the translation in the English for the Pali Canon, but the Chinese does not use the word short. It uses the word that would be more in line with the word subtle or relax.
The word what? Okay, because you were breaking up, Venerable.
The word
All right.
relax, yeah, the word
Yes.
relax instead of short.
The word what instead of short? The word
Relax.
relax, huh? Okay, well, so the recensions that we have in the Chinese show that as far as the first two steps of the so-called 16 steps are concerned, uh, they're not long short as per the Pali version. Rather, they are something like deep, shallow, right? And then there are other recensions that indicated that we're really talking about a variety of ways of breathing. And so this kind of lies in the face of the conventional wisdom that is based on a commentarial reading of the suttas, and that is somehow, if you concentrate hard enough, this is going to have a palpable effect on the way you breathe, and you're going to progress from breathing long to breathing short. Presumably, this has to do with slower bodily metabolism, and people would extrapolate from that passage that in the end, the so-called bodily base satipatthana is to attain the goal of slowing down the breath significantly, perhaps until when the breath completely disappears, right? So when we do a comparative study of the multiple recensions, we realize that it's not a linear progression from long to short, right? But rather we're talking about a variety of different breathings, like shallow, deep, fast, quick, so on and so forth.
Ajahn Dhamma who is a monk of about 30 years, he became a monk about the time that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa died, but he would be considered as definitely a student of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa. He refers to the short breath of the Anapanasati Sutta as more of a breathing style that sounds like that you're out of breath or that you're running uphill with a very quick breathing in and out. And that goes word short, but it does not go with the Chinese.
Right.
That the Chinese is more a progression from a deeper breath into, as the relaxation goes, it goes more shallow to where the quick breathing that Dhamma speaks of, more of an energizing breath to bring up oxygen level.
So this is just an opinion based on rather tenuous and circumstantial evidence, and that is that peculiar reading of the first two steps. If it was plausible, we would be able to find a lot of corroborating passages throughout the canon. But that isn't the case at all, right? In fact, what we see is the same 16-step practice, not necessarily framed in a 16-step way, but more or less the same contents are found throughout the different suttas, but oftentimes without breathing as an adjunct. So this goes to show that the focus is never really about the breath. The focus, and we also note how both in the Pali and the Chinese version, I train in something, something. It really starts with step number 3, right? With step number 1 and 2, there is an absence of the same kind of preface of I train in, right? I think this signifies that formal training really begins with 3 and 4. If you look at suttas with similar contents, such as the Payagatta Sati Sutta, uh, being aware of the body and then relaxing or tranquilizing bodily formations, bodily sankharas are done without any mention of the breath whatsoever. So I think that this whole notion of jhana, that the way it's so intimately coupled with techniques of manipulating the breath is really a much later derived development. In the early part of Buddhism, jhana is really very strictly associated with uh, seclusion from sensual craving, very specifically, that you are able to enjoy the ease, the refreshingness, the lightheartedness, the equanimity, and so forth that comes from your not having to busily participate in sensual craving. This constitutes the bulk of the kind of pleasure that one would find in jhana, rather than, say, your breath is manipulated in a certain way, and similar to the principle of qigong practice or pranayama practice. Somehow that in itself is the primary ingredient in inducing pleasure. So that's just my subjective opinion. I'm not saying that there's an overwhelming evidence showing that, oh, the breath has to be worked at one way or the other. I'm just pointing out the fact that this idea of anapana sati was really brought up in the context of people after having practiced the foulness contemplation, the asubha sort of practice, and they suffer from possible side effects, if you will. Some developing suicidal ideation, some develop pathological disgust towards the body, and to remedy that, uh, Buddha introduced the breath as a sort of soothing element, potentially encouraging equanimity. But I don't find evidence that the breath outside of that context plays such a crucial role in the culmination of samadhi.
That's actually very interesting, Dr. Miyamshu, that you say. Because I also remember Dhammarata say sometimes there is nothing in breath. I mean, except, I mean, sure, if you breathe well, it is good for the body. You will relax and whatnot. So it has some benefits in that regard. But if I just breathe, yeah, I don't believe something more will happen than those, physical and maybe some mental. But
Right. One of the reasons that people attribute magical or even mystical qualities to breathing exercise has to do with this assumption that Buddhist quote unquote concentration or samadhi or jhana and so forth is a function of your concentrating on a stable object, in this particular case, the breath. But as far as we could see, that's never how samadhi is defined in the suttas. Samadhi, at least in the context of jhanas, is really defined as, once again, ease, equanimity, that result from your delighting on the path of dispassion, or being able to unburden your body and mind from the weightiness of a very coarse type of craving. This can be done, the so-called seclusion-born pleasure can be done with or without the aid of breathing exercises. Yes, if you prefer to um, capitalize on the soothing quality of the breath as a sort of general background while you're focusing on the primary theme, the primary topic in the Satipatthana practice. that would be fine, but it's never really intended as the primary object of focus, if you will, in the early suttas. The practice of focusing strictly and exclusively on the breath, that really seemed to be more a Brahmanical practice rather than a Buddhist one. And you can see inklings in the early suttas where the Buddha was critical of people practicing concentration simply for the sake of restraining the mind.
Interesting. And the same thing can also then also be said about the position. I mean, we don't have to be in a
Right.
specific so-called meditation position to do the practice.
That's absolutely correct. So if you were to look at archaeological evidence, like either in the arena of religious iconography, or if you look at the way, say, for example, these yoga postures are depicted in very ancient times, hardly ever is full lotus depicted. So as far as we could tell, what we typically associate with Buddhist meditation, this formal way of sitting, right, full lotus, is really a relatively late development. I would personally find it very unlikely that the Buddha himself adopted this sitting posture. And you know how part of the monastic codes of discipline deals with public opinion of the Sangha, right? So presenting a inspiring image so that you do not short sell the Dharma, right? So that people do not think less of the Dhamma due to the less than dignified ways that monks and nuns may potentially conduct themselves. And this perhaps led to an overly formal presentation of monks and nuns spending all day in full lotus posture, right? Thinking that this is what they are doing as far as your posture is concerned. But we get a lot of indications from very ancient sources that Buddha, the early generation disciples, they practice meditation in every conceivable type of posture, oftentimes based on practical considerations. Um, I personally am of the opinion that leading a sedentary life, sitting for extended period, especially using such a restrictive posture, such as the full lotus, is really detrimental to the physical health, at least for most people. Okay, there may be few exceptions, but on the most part, I personally will encourage you're developing a better sensitivity to your bodily need as far as posture is concerned. It's not due to laziness, it's not due to lack of discipline that you feel like standing up after sitting for a long time. You feel like exercising, you feel like walking. Those are really the body's way of telling you that you need to get your circulation going. It's the way that body is sharing its wisdom with you. And so if we internalize this idea that um, somehow jhana is about stillness, samadhi, and any sort of physical movement would undermine the purity of that stillness, and therefore, we should sit for as long as we can and for as still as we can. That kind of idea, number one, is not conducive to physical health, as we mentioned. And number two, at least in my humble opinion, is also not conducive to uh, the induction of happiness, joy, and ease, and relaxation, peace, and physical comfort. All of these ingredients are really so important in the stabilization of samadhi. One of the things
Thank you.
one of the things we noticed about the way the Buddha taught was that he really understood the nature of intention. So on the one hand, intention is exceedingly precarious and fleeting and unreliable and tenuous, right? And so whatever resolve we feel like we've given rise to with regards to wanting to practice, right? Sometimes we really feel strongly about how we wanted to strive diligently and so forth. But that's not a state you could really trust in being able to just self-sustain indefinitely, right? So you have to learn to go out of your way to preserve your intention to practice. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that you don't get yourself unnecessarily in pain or in discomfort. You don't end up being, perhaps even at a subconscious level, scared of meditation practice because all the pain that you've experienced in the past and the subtle association you have formed about the practice and this kind of pain, right? You want to understand that the development of any sort of habit, including the habit to meditate, is closely linked to how much palpable and immediate, as long as long-term rewards you're reaping. And if you're able to see how accessible meditation really is, and you don't set up these very unrealistic goals for yourself, right? You don't have these unrealistic and highfalutin expectation about what stillness means, what samadhi means, but rather you respect your present condition. In your present condition, maybe this is the amount of ease you're able to enjoy. Maybe this is the amount of peace. Maybe this is the amount of taking a break from busyness that you are able to appreciate. Don't neglect that. Don't overlook that. Don't think of it as something so trivial or like so modest in achievement. The Buddha frequently employed these behavioral principles where in your first experience of anything good, like joy and relaxation, ease and peace and what have you, right? You learn to recognize that as a good quality. You learn to appreciate it. You learn to develop confidence in that dimension. You learn to savor it, right? To enjoy that with even greater abandon, realizing that that's not the kind of happiness that is addictive in nature or potentially spiritually harmful. So you're going to be able to more wholeheartedly embrace the kind of good state before you would have a chance to become stabilized in that state. These are the type of behavioral principles that the Buddha employed, rather than, like just use your willpower and just sit for as long as you can. I mean, it's possible that you possess extraordinary superhuman willpower, right? And you're able to overcome much hindrances in your spiritual practice. But in the end, that is not to be trusted. In the end, in fact, I would argue, the ultimate goal of the Dharma, which is about aiding letting go, that happens not because you choose to do so. That happens because all the requisite conditions are mature and your mind is ready to let go, right? You don't see any other alternative but to let go, because the alternative would be suffering.
Mm. Very beautiful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more question, but maybe if someone else, because I can talk all day, so I'll let someone else first.
Oh, come on, go ahead. I'm enjoying this.
Dr. William, can you say please something about Metta? Sometimes we have, lately we had a discussion about whether to do the Metta or not. Some of us also, I
Right.
think Dhamma to be translated like we see it like something like friendliness.
Mm,
Basically,
right,
some Dhamma practitioners, they say things like, "Oh, may all beings be happy,"
right,
for example,
right,
and it sounds very nice, but that
right.
is somewhere like magical thinking. I mean, we cannot.
Yeah,
Yeah, can you
yeah.
say maybe?
Okay, yeah. So of course, when people talk about metta, they oftentimes think about the idea in the Mahayana context, right? And in the Mahayana context, is frequently defined as, to bring happiness to all beings, right? To perhaps even um, take upon yourself the mission to deliver all sentient beings, or something to that effect. Uh, from the Buddha's own perspective, from the perspective of the teaching of the historical Buddha, it's it's probably a very bad policy. If you make it your life's mission, a kind of radical altruism, right? So the Buddha's general advice about living a life where you will more likely enjoy ease and happiness and benefit from the Dhamma is one where you have few desires, few duties, few affairs. I understand that life circumstances oftentimes will give us no choice, right? There are situations where we have to take up duties, or we have to take up obligations and so forth. But the general advice is for us to be content with simplicity and to never really unnecessarily shoulder responsibility, much less a responsibility of saving all living beings, right? Um, the in the Metta Sutta, there is this passage that is really frequently misquoted or misinterpreted. The passage has something to do with treating something as your only child. And most people who read the passage understand it as meaning treating all living beings as your only child,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And if that's the way you understand metta, then it makes sense to translate the term as something like loving kindness, right? But when you look at the renunciant culture of early Buddhism, being maternal, being motherly to living beings in general is a bad policy, unless you absolutely have to do it, right? But as a practitioner, I cannot imagine that the Buddha, you know, encouraging us to cultivate a quality that is motherly like, that is loving in nature, that is somehow concerned about taking on the responsibility to help all beings. Um, if you look at the way metta is practiced in the oldest setting, it's almost always phrased in a negative way, meaning that it's not about what you ought to do, but rather it's about learning not to burden yourself with useless mindsets such as unforgivingness, such as hatred, such as aversion, such as enmity, right? Such as holding grudge, right? Resentment, complaint, what have you. So instead of translating metta as loving kindness, which really suggests a kind of active, positivistic duty, or it entails a kind of duty, it's probably better to think of metta either as goodwill, right, or as simply freedom from aversion type of sentiments. Um, and metta as a loving kindness kind of practice is already largely espoused in the Brahmanical, in the non-Buddhist context. So if you look at the traditional way the god Brahma was portrayed, was depicted, right? He has multiple heads, he had multiple arms, and so forth. And the reason for a kind of physical feature has to do with his supposed mental quality, and that is he is looking in all directions for sentient beings who are in need of his help. His multiple arms are a metaphor of the many skillful means he would employ in granting people's wishes and solving their problems and responding to their prayers, and you know and what did the Buddha say about metta very specifically? He actively incorporated that practice into the midst of the Dharma, but with significant modification, right? So he basically says something to the effect that for metta to become a useful tool for the liberative goal, for the transmundane goal, like winning the fruitions and so forth, you need to practice it independence of seclusion, dispassion, cessation, leading to letting go, right? And so what that means is you look at the way that metta is in your mind, whether or not it's conducive to, say, dispassion. If it's not, right, or in fact, it's the opposite. It's encouraging the opposite of dispassion, right? It's encouraging the opposite of seclusion. Then you know
Yeah.
it's not the direction that the Buddha had in mind.
Something I've been really appreciating about the Dharma language. I'm not sure if it's a coincidence or not. Like even the word metta is translated as non-harm, which I really like the word non. Like it's just it seems to me I'm not sure if this is the right word. Apophatic. Apophatic is like a negative way of describing something, but
Okay, so just to
yeah.
clarify, I think what you have in mind is a different word, is ahimsa. It's harmlessness, freedom from harm and harmfulness and so forth. So you are right. But you are right in saying that these qualities in Buddhism, they're pretty much defined negatively, right? Just like ahimsa, it's not about your having to go out there and practice releasing animals to the wild, as is a common practice in Chinese Buddhism, right? To purchase eel and fish, from the market and release them at the local ponds and lake. Um, Oftentimes, um, with a neglect of potential ecological consequences of that action. So it
Makes
would be
it worse, yeah. Yeah.
right. Yeah. So it's much better, as you have pointed out, to simply understand that practice as freedom from harmfulness, right? And in the case of metta, it's really freedom from aversion, right? Freedom from amity, freedom from begrudgment, and so forth.
Yeah, if I so one thing I want to kind of touch on and need your clarification on was uh I noticed it depends on how one sees it. Like the Dharma language, even the word dispassion, it might create some like negativity inside people, right? Because it's like losing something. Like there's a
Oh.
the word itself sounds negative, but
Yeah.
actually when we understand it from the goal of the Dharma, whatever, it's actually a very joyful word. I guess I just want to ask, like, is many of this word intentional, like, or is just a bad translation? Is it just a bad translation from
Well,
Pali? Yeah.
for one thing, these words usually carry with very different cultural connotation in a different time, right? And then secondly, the Buddha's teaching is really very radical. And your mind has to already be in a certain condition to really appreciate the profundity, the depth, the thoroughness, the beauty of his teaching. And the way the Buddha taught dispassion is typically not in telling people to just let go from the get-go, right? He oftentimes described his teaching as being gradual in nature, as involving gradual pacification of sankharas. And so to be more specific, this oftentimes involves your being able to withdraw your mind from very gross, from obviously suffering types of mental states, right? So for example, if you're able to simply learn to seclude yourself from a very competitive mode, from a busily reactive mode, while you're operating in the realm of sensual desire. And your initial meditation is not necessarily to attain something very lofty, but to just, enjoy some intermittent break from that ostensibly suffering state. And if you're the person with the right discernment, if you train yourself to appreciate what is a lure, what is a limitation in your present condition, you'll see that you don't have to go into very deep meditation to find it enjoyable. Even if you are able to diminish your present gross suffering by 10%, by 5%, by even 1%, as long as it's a discernible reduction of suffering, your mind can be trained to enjoy that. And once your mind could appreciate dispassion towards gross suffering, it's only a matter of degree before your mind can appreciate dispassion towards any kind of sankhara, any kind of attachment, right? So if you follow the gradual path, these radical words, these radical ideas will not be so off-putting. They will not be so scary, so intimidating. Rather, you will really appreciate how, when the Buddha says to let go, he's really telling you that there's not an iota of experience that you can cling to. That you can claim ownership over, right? Doership or I amship over, right? And this kind of thoroughgoingness of the Dharma is one of the things that makes the Buddha's teaching so unique. When I hear words like dispassion, instead of feeling pessimistic, feeling dejected, I am every single time, almost every single time unfailingly, I experience joy. It's just, wow, just the beauty of the word. I cannot get tired of, the mind being reminded of turning away from attachment.
Thank you. Thank you. If I may, real quick, this also the word gradual seems to be very interesting because I do notice sometimes people get trapped in that connotation because the word that comes to mind is stages. This word always seems very interesting to me. Because I don't know, it implies to me like there's like a lot of work to be done, and it creates this sort of like
Yeah,
restlessness among
yeah.
people. So yeah, it's
Um,
like the word stages. Is the word stages something that
okay.
Agama in the Sutta they use it? So yeah.
I understand where you're saying. So I appreciate that question. There's a tendency, um, as Buddhism was developing historically, to not just formalize stages, but to ossify them. So what was originally a pedagogy, like a teaching um, consideration, to make the Dharma more accessible to people, in fact, to make the Dharma less intimidating to people. When ossified, it produced the opposite effect, right? So when we hear words like first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, right? And go, wow, all these. I mean, I don't. I can hardly wrap my mind around first jhana, much less all the other ones, right? There are these stages of insight. If you look at, like a sutta, like the Chula Shinata Sutta, there are these different perceptions you're supposed to master, that you're supposed to stabilize yourself in. they really present a very daunting, overly hierarchical picture of how we progress spiritually. Now, if you understand the general principle, the Dhamma, and how to gradually coach yourself to ease yourself into the mind states that you're ready for, right? So you're not forcing yourself to jump through the loop. You're not forcing yourself to appreciate things you're not yet able to appreciate. But we are able to make baby steps, and in those baby steps, we recognize, oh, so there is a reduction of suffering, right? There is mental inspiration. There is gladness. There is this sense of abundance, maybe by a little bit, by a little bit. If you just follow similar behavioral principle, I'm going to be out on a limb on this and say that you could pretty much ignore much of the traditional formalized hierarchy and
Mm.
still succeed brilliantly in your spiritual practice. I am of the opinion that the way that these stages are formalized, these are much later developments, right? So there are four jhanas. Some people say there are 5 stages jhanas. Some people say there are 8 stages of meditative training, 9 stages of meditative training if you count cessation, attainment, right? Um, and they become intimidated by it. But once you understand the general principle, right, how to play with your perception, how to uh, be with your feeling so that the pleasant side oftentimes can be maximized, and it help you not become stuck in the pleasant side, but help you become more sensitive about subtle stress, about subtle suffering, any instance of mental exertion. And practice can be organic, practice can be highly personalized. Practice is very fun. Practice is joy filled, right? You get up in the morning and feeling like, wow, how fortunate I am to have a purpose in life, to really, be guided by a noble cause, by these meanings. Nothing to really be scared of. You'll find how easy, how accessible the Dharma is.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. It also seems like it comes from the, I don't know, I'm just like, it comes from like maybe Visuddhimagga, Abhidhamma, the later um, additions, that's why the stages. I'm not sure. It's just something that's how I
Some
see it.
stages are developed by the commentary, some are not, right? But
That's
in
it.
general, the formal hierarchies are later development. So, for example, when you look at the oldest, right, the most ancient layers in the suttas, the jhanas are not really differentiated. They're not numerically, differentiated. It's just jhana. In fact, you could even argue. I mean, if you can make a pretty cogent case about how even the spiritual fruitions originally might not be 4. The idea that there are 4 different fruitions, that is also possibly a later development. Um,
Yeah.
so it's very likely that you know first there is one, right? The ending of all effluence, right? The ending of all ashavas, and then there's 2. There are people who um, have put an end to sensual craving, but there is a tiny residual of the I am conceit. There's a tiny residual of the Dharma delight. Right? Mentally, these people still revel in the Dharma. They still are somewhat dependent
Mm.
on the Dharma. And this is very possibly the provenance of the idea of a non-returnership. Um, and it's really perhaps, this is not very clear, all right? So I'm kind of heading into gray, ambiguous area here. So it would not surprise me if the notion of stream entry and the second fruition, they come about during King Ashoka's time or slightly after that. It wouldn't surprise me.
Mhm. Yeah. I remember you mentioning how, during King Ashoka time, there could be certain intention of trying to mystify or make it more magical. And again, that's not really, but yeah, I remember that.
Mm. Right, that's right. That was a time when imperial sponsorship was a real thing. So there was really very strong incentives for Buddhists to put on certain play, to assume a sort of formal religious identity, right? To become self-aware enough that they're in some kind of rivalry with quote unquote other religions. Um, but that was a unique time period, giving rise to quite a few interesting and, dare we say, rather incompatible features in the Buddhist literature, where you started seeing the Buddha becoming kind of this snobbish figure who, as soon as he was born, he took 7 steps, with one finger pointing to the heaven, the other to the ground, right? In the whole universe, I'm foremost, and so forth. That just struck me as something um, awfully un-Buddhistic thing to say. uh,
Yeah. Kawa, you have any question?
Dr.
Hello.
William, can you maybe, how can I say it? Is the whole practice in essence just a practice for us to basically to practice being satisfied and being at ease, and that's it?
okay, so in the beginning, you may feel that way, right? You may feel like, oh, like there's this rather limited goal in the Dharma practice, and that is just to kind of make us content enough to go through life. But eventually, as you let go, more and more attachment, right? And some of these attachments are very subtle, they are deeply entrenched in people's subconscious, usually, so to speak. Once these are removed, y- the experience becomes increasingly defying explanation. A lot of the old concepts you used to entertain, they're overturned, right? You have a completely different view of uh, what is a person, who is a self, right? What is your relationship with the universe? And really, it'll get you to an almost a mystical place. I understand that mysticism, as is ordinarily construed, has great limitation, but um, when you begin to experience profound and unprecedented peace and the cooling down of passion, you will not uh, simply describe it as, oh, I'm just a more contented person. It's like a lot of these old limitations, these old categorizations, ways of thinking about yourself, things about thinking about you as a person and so forth. They get completely blown away, and you start appreciating the deeper, the more inexpressible dimension of the Dhamma. You start appreciating how, in the end, um, it's really concept defiling. It's really you, you'd be stumped to try to articulate the sort of peace, as a sort of cooling down that is possible. Um,
And it all does start with practicing being satisfied and at ease and joyful.
well, the practice is more than that, right? So being easily satisfied, being contented, and so forth. These are very conducive to especially the eradication of sensual craving, right? And for some people, that's enough to take them even to the level where the I am conceit is eradicated, right? Oftentimes, um, that would not be enough, right? Oftentimes, the person would have to receive further instruction in order to really root out any notion of doership, any notion of I amship in the mental stream. So learning to become satisfied and so forth, that's a very good starting place. It's it's a place where people will not be afraid of meditation, right? They'll learn to see that letting go is not a matter of deprivation. It doesn't mean that when you let go, you're missing out on pleasure in life. You're missing out on happiness in life, but rather you become abundant internally, right? You destroy the sense of lack internally, and it's better than any sort of sensory stimulation you could hope to undergo in life. Um, but oftentimes people will need to be given a little more instruction than just to be satisfied. I'm speaking in very general terms, right? So
No,
there
it's
are of
very
course
interesting.
exceptions. Yeah, there are exceptions. There are people who you could give them a little bit, and just due to the overall maturity of their spiritual faculty, they could just go off from there. Once they have a good foundation in jhanic experience, your mind just becomes increasingly cooling down, just increasingly quiescent. So that's possible too. I've seen few people who are capable of making that kind of progress.
Kayla, do you have any question? Or Michael?
And if
I'm not
you're
sure.
not other questions, you don't have to feel obligated to. We could bring an
Yeah,
end to the session at any time, right? I'm okay with, we're almost at the 1 hour mark. If you feel like
yeah.
uh, raising a few more points, I'm happy to stick around for a little longer. But otherwise, there's no don't feel obligated, right, to have to ask questions if you're just happy sitting here.
The same alma mater from Crush in UCLA, so I may indulge in being encouraged to have some questions. Yes, maybe, but
I didn't
I'm
catch the
not. But that was
first
too
part.
sudden. That was too sudden. I was not expecting it. Like I got the background like shoot of what? Okay, what is that Q&A about? And like what? Oh, that was too late. I guess I was not aware. Yeah, but if you don't mind me asking a quick question, since you have some, be a bunch, I don't know. I got if 7 billion people. I was not prepared. If in from the, you probably know D'Amato actually advertises to immediate practice, as you get safe, secure, in sorry, you get safe, secure, and comfortable, and then you say you stay with the anchor, and you see Mara, you see that Mara will eventually come, and you see that, and you see that again, and you keep doing that stuff. Do you have another angle for it on the Zen practice that you have experience for?
Okay. By the way, my apologies. Number one, I couldn't hear very clearly what you're saying, and number two,
Okay.
I am not familiar with the Venable's teaching, so much to my own demise. This is my loss. So I've pretty much lead a pretty isolated life as far as interacting with other meditation teachers are concerned. So I'm usually not familiar with what people are teaching. I mean, short of the few very famous teachers, and also the ones that I have practiced under, that, whose retreats I've joined. So I am not familiar with Venerable's teaching here. So let me just get that out of the way first. Yeah. And what the question was about my angle on this particular teaching. And once again, my apologies for my ignorance about the Venerable's teaching. Yeah.
Red, don't know. You want to say that again?
It would be what, I don't know if I'm sounding okay. I don't know. My quality was being really dubious those days. Yeah, no, no worries. If you don't know the
Okay.
practice, it's no worries.
Yeah. Mhm.
Over here in the Sangha, there was an emphasis on gladdening the mind, which I found it to be very helpful in the practice here. There was an encouragement to get oneself into a joyful, happy state with the wholesome thought as the right effort that taught by the Buddha. Seeing the unwholesome and immediately making the change, not tolerating the hindrances. And I found that to be very helpful. And it also seems to mirror something you say, which is once someone gets the taste of the first jhana, there was an encouragement to keep practicing. And that's what I see for myself. I think that's what Red Donald was asking your opinion on that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, in general, that's a very great approach, right? My only, I guess, the only thing I probably would add to that um, is that I sometimes work with people who obviously started out with depression-related symptoms. People whose baseline is perhaps more depressed than the neurologically normal people. And for these people, sometimes it's just impractical for them to feel inspired in a joyous way, for them to experience happiness necessarily, right? So to me, positive reinforcement can come in many different ways, right? So happiness and pleasure and so forth, they're absolutely positive reinforcements, but so can mere reduction in suffering. So can a very robustly developed equanimity. So there are instances where um, happiness and pleasure, they're just very, very difficult to attain given the psychological environmental conditions that people find themselves in. And to a large extent, you can make up for that by developing equanimity in a certain way. So personally, I will not say that, oh, the different jhanic factors, they are all absolutely necessarily that, somehow they cannot be circumvented. I'm of the humble opinion that just people are just so different. You have to look at individual cases, and sometimes if you tell people to be happy, it has a paradoxical effect of undermining that very possibility, right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And if there are no other issues, we could, call it a
Yeah.
day at this point, or however way you prefer.
I will hand it to Mikey.
Yeah, we'll give you guys one last chance here. Jonas, Michael, Caleb, Karwan. Anybody want to say any last things before we wrap it up here?
Maybe just one last thing. Dependent origination. There are some Buddhists that they see those 12 links or steps
Yeah,
like happening in 3 lifetimes.
yeah.
And some of us, I think more of here, we see that like something happening right now in our present moment almost. The way I understand.
Yeah,
Can you see me something about that?
yeah. Okay, so I usually take a actually critical perspective on reading sutta passages. And so what I could see pretty clearly is that this 12-link dependent origination is a later development.
Mm.
You could see that there are many different schemes of dependent origination featured in the early suttas, some featuring um, 10 factors, some featuring 7 factors, 5 factors, perhaps even 2 factors. When you say craving is a cause of suffering, as is phrased in the Four Noble Truths, that is a kind of dependent origination, by the way. Okay, so when we talk about dependent origination, we're not necessarily talking about the so-called 12 link and so forth, right? And people, one of the reasons that people would get into a debate about whether the dependent origination spans across multiple lifetimes or it's really about something happening right now has to do with perhaps people's assumptions on what dependent origination ultimately is about, what the teaching is for, right? So, yes, it's a plausible way to look at dependent origination as, it's describing an unfolding process that you are witnessing, right? And somehow the witnessing of which will lead to a kind of awakening, right? That's fine. I totally accept that as one possible approach. But on the most part, though, when you read the dependent origination in context, oftentimes the Buddha would talk about maybe just a few factors. And with regards to just one link or 2 links, and you develop once again disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, leading to letting go, and somehow the person is awakened. So, in other words, another important function of the dependent origination is simply to explain to people how this so-called mental world, how the so-called existence, sankhara existence, how we take for granted, is this way, and so you become disenchanted. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Sometimes the Buddha simply explained ignorance conditions sankhara, right? Usually the first 2 of the nidanas as featured in the 12-link dependent origination. In some suttas, just by focusing on this one single link, it led to people attaining spiritual fruition. So what is going on? If we could truly experience in our own life how every instance of unawakened sankhara is conditioned by ignorance, your mind will be imbued with a sense of samvega. It will be imbued with a sense of nibbida. You will have a completely different relationship with intention in general. Most of us, we look at intention as the free will that we exercise. So we revel in the play of it, right? We revel in the idea of doership. We revel in our ability to create, to build up, to participate, and so forth. If you are able to see that intention is really fundamental, at least unawakened intention is fundamentally what? Impulses informed by primordial ignorance. Right? And you see this clearly, then you are likely to become what? Dispassionate towards sankhara. By the way, not only can you do this with regards to the first link, you can do this with regards to any one of the links. When you read the older layers of the suttas, oftentimes the dependent origination is not featured in the way that we are familiar with. Sometimes it simply says consciousness and nama rupa, they have this relationship. They have this entangling relationship. For a lot of people, this teaching is enough to fill their minds with disenchantment. If you really understand what is consciousness, right? Consciousness is really taking on a body and a name. You're taking on an identity. You're believing that you're this person. You're believing that you're this set of phenomena, right? And when you can clearly see this, once again, your mind may be filled with disenchantment, filled with dispassion, and so forth. So, is it possible that when you contemplate on dependent origination as spanning across 3 lifetimes, it produces that kind of psychological effect? Yes, it's possible. Is it possible if you were to see this as unfolding right here, right now in the present experience? Yes, it's possible. There's nothing in the Buddha's meditation that is just about focusing in the present moment. That's really a commentarial notion. The commentarial idea of satipatthana, of vipassana, it has to be present moment. Otherwise, you're dealing with the conceptual domain. You're dealing with concepts, right? You're dealing with the invocation of memory. So what? It doesn't matter whether you're contemplating on the present moment or if you are contemplating on a memory, as long as it produces the liberation conducive sentiments, such as disenchantment, dispassion, and so forth, you have a very good chance of experiencing letting go.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a very, very nice answer to hear. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you, I appreciate it. And I assume there's nothing else, and it has been my pleasure to be joined by all these noble friends, by fellow truth seekers. Thank you. I'm happy to be of service.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, maybe
Thank you,
until
Dr.
next time.
Chu.
All right.
Yeah,
Please take care.
that would be splendid. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.